Hello, Comrade Rednuts. How's it going? How are ya? I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing this to you after hearing your rant on socialism, and would like to share some thoughts as a former listener who bailed on your show after learning about this thing called the alt-right pipeline. Growing up in the suburbs of Boston, I was always very anti-establishment, and gravitated towards punk, hip-hop, and stand-up comedy from a young age. George Carlin continues to be a huge influence on my life as I go into my 40th year on this planet. Back in 2016, I was listening to pretty much everything you were putting out, and was under the impression that guys like you and Rogan were deprogramming yourselves of toxic ideas, while still also being into cars and sports and guns and chicks and insult humor, which, believe it or not, are all accepted over here on the intolerant left, as long as you don't make it your entire personality and are willing to take time to learn about other people's lifestyles. Despite giving you the benefit of the doubt for a while, it started to seem like punching down was part of your brand. And the things you were saying about marginalized people, especially the trans community, sounded a lot like the quiet extremism Joe was starting to get a reputation for. To express confusion about something that's foreign to you is understandable, but when you confidently announce your bewilderment in front of millions of people, it gives off the impression that you believe the topic being discussed cannot and should not be understood. I'll tell you right now that there are way more trans guys trying to kick ass in men's sports than there are hairy 6'3" dudes like me transitioning so they can dominate women's sports. That shit has literally never happened, yet every single shaved head white guy with a podcast can't stop fantasizing about it. From over here, it just sounds like you're expressing your very real concerns about the many ways men manipulate women. And that's what you think trans people are doing. It doesn't really sound like a joke. Where comedians say they're going against the status quo by saying whatever they want on stage, many trans people are doing that every time they leave the house. Most people will never truly express themselves in public because they're afraid of the ridicule they'll receive if they do. It takes a lot of courage, and you have to do it a lot before you get good at it. I think comedians of all people would understand this better than most and defend trans rights, regardless of whether or not you understand it. But instead, you heckle them. So it's nice to hear you speak truthfully about socialism, which, much like the LGBTQIA+ community, has always existed and gets demonized by those in power who would rather treat people like human livestock. Maybe the pink-haired lesbian you see on CNN isn't the best representation of the movement because it's their first time on camera. Or I don't know, maybe CNN is a capitalist media organization that wants to delegitimize progressive movements by platforming shitty spokespeople. Marxism, in its most basic form, states that capitalism is unable and unwilling to address the needs of humanity. That's what you, and many others, are observing. Instead of bitching about Antifa, BLM, and the left, every single comedian worth a damn should be calling out the Christian white male-dominated capitalist media. That's what Carlin did. But the further left you go, the less attention you get. The further right you go, the more of a chance you'll be invited onto Joe Rogan. So what I'm going to do now is expand on a lot of the things you said in response to the socialism question, while providing some insight on how some of it still ends up unintentionally perpetuating some bad ideas. I hope you and your fans take the time to listen. Cheers, you big-hearted, cishet white male fuck. Matthew Nicholas. Hello, and welcome to Middleside Topwise. I wrote this essay towards the end of 2022, not knowing that in February of 2023, the U.S. House of Representatives would pass a bill denouncing socialism in all forms using a lot of the information I'm going to debunk in this essay. American fascism is spreading in three ways: through the military-industrial complex, which includes the police, the subjugation of minority groups, and economic regression. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Every country that has tried socialism has failed, and it's responsible for tens of millions of deaths.
Before we even get into your response, let's dig into this juicy tidbit of disinformation. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that this self-proclaimed moron is playing 3D chess with you. This, statistic comes from the heavily disputed introduction to 1997's The Black Book of Communism, because you know right-wingers aren't out here reading whole books. It's on page 4. When I say heavily disputed, I mean that many of the co-authors that contributed to the book immediately denounced the work of historian Stéphane Courtat after publication, who confidently claimed, based on unofficial estimates, that the collective deaths under communist regimes has reached nearly 100 million people. This is what is known as comparative trivialization of the Holocaust. and your reaction fed right into it. The International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania provides a number of valuable insights on the evolution of anti-Semitism, including the false notion that the Jewish community seeks to build a monopoly on suffering for lucrative purposes by promoting Holocaust awareness, when in fact, experts on the Holocaust have repeatedly shown that its uniqueness is not argued in order to transform the tragedy of the Jewish people into the only collective suffering that should be paid attention, or into a tragedy incomparable to any other, but in order to draw attention to the extreme specificity of the Nazi collective project. Even if the communist death toll was true, the claim is that they occurred in dozens of independent nations, for all sorts of different reasons, between the years of 1917 and 1991. Also, despite the very real anti-Semitism and imprisonment of political dissidents that existed within the USSR, when Stalin's successors opened the gates of the Gulag, they allowed 3 million inmates to return home. When the Allies liberated the Nazi death camps, they found thousands of human skeletons barely alive, awaiting what they knew to be inevitable execution.
So would you say capitalism is working when like 99% of the wealth is in like 2% of the people's hands?
As a sports fan, I'm sure you know that in competition, someone has to lose in order for someone else to win. Capitalism is a competition to see who can hoard the most money. And now the game is over.
You did it!
The top 10 richest people on the planet, 9 of whom are American, have doubled their wealth since 2020. A lot of this has to do with the fact that since 1978, the ratio of CEO to worker pay has risen nearly 1,000%, while the average pay of workers rose only 10%. This has all occurred during a long period of government deregulation on both sides of the aisle.
You know, that whole suddenly America's like the biggest oil producer and the biggest guy. That was me.
We've also witnessed 2 separate occasions over the past 20 years in which the United States government has had to ask communist China for money so they could give it directly to capitalists that failed to compete in the global market. Or should I say, intentionally tanked the market for profit. Taxing the rich and creating more social welfare programs does not stop capitalists from exploiting everything in sight. Don't even get me started on the giving pledge. That shit's getting its own essay. The only solution to class warfare is to implement a system where all workers are proportionately compensated based on the profits they make. This Forbes article from 2014 discusses the benefits of worker cooperatives, which include job sustainability, the strengthening of the middle class, and a natural decentralization of wealth. This can all be done without giving unnecessary power to the government. An example of this would be the Spanish corporation Mondragon, which reported 12 billion euros in revenue across 4 sectors in 2013 and caps executive wages at a 9-to-1 ratio. They currently employ more than 80,000 people and run a non-profit university that focuses on worker development. However, while still under the capitalist mode of production, they've been criticized for utilizing
Sweatshop labor.
Slave labor has always been the cornerstone of capitalist production. After the Great Famine and subsequent plague wiped out half of the European population in the 1300s, feudal lords were faced with a decision: either cater to the peasant revolts that were becoming increasingly common due to wealth inequality and inflation, or find a new source of human capital. For the next 300 years, 12 million Africans were enslaved and brought over to European-owned plantations. However, only about 5% of them were brought to the 13 colonies. The majority were sent to the Caribbean and Portuguese Brazil, where slavery was not abolished until 1888. Indentured servitude, in which tens of thousands of Indian and Chinese people were kidnapped and forced into short-term labor contracts, was abolished in 1920, coincidentally right around the time when women were being introduced into the workforce. Meanwhile, poor European men were being offered acres of free land in the New World via the Homestead Act of 1862. These Irish and British and Italian and Polish and Slavic and Swedish and German workers would loyally serve the American coal and steel and oil and paper industries until they started labor unions and everything got moved to China in the 80s. Coincidentally, just a few years after the death of revolutionary communist leader Mao Zedong. The minimum wage in China maxes out at about 25 yen, or $4 an hour. Federal U.S. law states that tipped employees can be paid as little as $2.13, because, states' rights and all. And get this, if you're under the age of 20, you can legally be paid $4.25 for the first 90 days of employment. How's that for a summer job? When you seek employment under capitalism, you're not only competing with other workers for the position, you are competing with your employer for wages and benefits. They'd pay you nothing if they could. Union busting is a nebulous crime for this very reason, as you can always find a worker who will choose their own success over the collective.
It sounds like employees, associates, they're listened to.
And without going through union politicians.
Of course not. You see, management recognizes our associates.
Anyone who's worked in the retail or service industries will tell you that managers are often the most divisive and self-serving employees, and are promoted based on these qualities. The manager that argues for better wages gets fired. The manager that negotiates the pizza party is a Democrat.
You know, corporations are buying houses now. They're just buying them up so they can fucking Airbnb. Like, literally the American dream, buying a house. They're going to take that away in this country.
Okay, now that the majority of manufacturing jobs are overseas, and the majority of stateside jobs pay absolute shit, capitalists once again need a new revenue stream. What's something that people will always have to pay for, no matter how much it costs? Housing. If you've seen The Big Short, you're familiar with the incredibly shady practice of bundling mortgages into securities that can then be traded amongst investment firms. Now let's name some names. Blackstone Inc. was created in 1985 by Richard Nixon's former Secretary of Commerce, Peter G. Peterson, and Donald Trump presidential campaign financier, Stephen Schwarzman. By 1987, they were able to finalize their first private equity fund in the wake of the devastating stock market crash commonly referred to as Black Monday. This would become a pattern. In 1991, they entered the real estate market, acquiring the Ramada, Howard Johnson, Super 8, and Days Inn hotel chains under a single holding company, Hospitality Franchise Systems. They also purchased the Loewen Group, the second largest funeral home and cemetery operator in North America, as well as a handful of independent cable TV providers. In October 2000, Blackstone acquired the mortgage for Building 7 at the World Trade Center in New York. Shortly after, Peterson would be hired as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Of course, nothing of note happened in 2001. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. So let's jump to 2002, when Blackstone somehow managed to create the largest private equity fund to ever exist, right in the middle of yet another recession.
The speech came as lawmakers tried to rewrite Bush's plan to buy up $700 billion in bad loans.
In 2008, Blackstone went public, which is said to have netted Schwarzman $684 million and allowed Peterson to start his own foundation with $1 billion in pocket change, ironically dedicated to fiscal responsibility and addressing sustainability challenges that threaten America's future.
We've got to take advantage of the crazy prices that people are paying. So we decided to sell half of what we bought the same day we bought it. Most of the people who bought from us got into enormous financial trouble or went insolvent.
Since then, Blackstone has purchased tens of thousands of foreclosed rental units at home and abroad, not to mention huge parts of the Amazon rainforest. In 2019, Schwarzman was presented with a UN Human Rights Council report on his activities and states, "A number of your policies and measures are inconsistent with international human rights law and norms. The threat of eviction creates fear, anxiety, and housing insecurity, inconsistent with requirements of the right to housing. Evictions which result in homelessness are a violation of the right to housing under international human rights law."
All of these tent cities, you're telling me this is working?
As we've seen, it's more profitable for banks to let homeowners default on their loans than simply collect interest payments on them. And it's more profitable for landlords to continually increase the rent on their properties than to offer long-term affordable housing. So to answer your question, yes, I do believe capitalism is working as intended. There are a few winners and lots of losers. Supply and demand does not apply to housing. There are 33 vacant homes for every single homeless person in America. The homeless population serves as an advertisement for what happens to you when you lose the game of capitalism. Workers are less likely to revolt and more likely to accept low wages and high costs when the alternative is living in a tent on the street. The 2009 study, Where We Sleep, the cost of housing and homelessness in Los Angeles, found that states spend $35,000 to $150,000 per year per homeless person, whereas just giving them free housing costs just over $7,000 per year per person and creates a situation where they can potentially reintegrate into society within a few years. That cost then goes down to zero. But the goal of the capitalist government is to make money for capitalists, not to solve problems. Compassionate capitalists see homelessness as an opportunity to develop innovative new housing initiatives. From tiny homes to the many influencers promoting van life, housing insecurity is being taken advantage of by these compassionate capitalists looking to take money from consumers on the brink of survival mode. The less compassionate capitalists suggest that the homeless population be round up and put in cages, or worse. This requires billions of dollars in police and prison funding and the expansion of vagrancy laws. In other words, bigger government. Cops and judges and prosecutors and politicians are well paid based on the presumption that they are using the power of the state to keep America safe. Keep in mind that there is no restriction on government employees from buying stock in weapons manufacturers, private prisons, gentrified real estate, Dunkin' Donuts, or any of the other industries that will benefit government officials. There is no incentive to diminish crime or rehabilitate criminals under capitalism. There is an incredible incentive to demonize and incite the poor and profit from their demise.
You know what's funny about people? You don't like it, get the fuck out of here. Yet you can look at your sports team and be like, what the fuck is this coach doing? And then nobody goes like, you don't go fucking root for somebody else. No, I'm criticizing it because I love it and I want it to win.
As someone who's constantly arguing with right-wingers, I hear this statement all the time and have come to the conclusion that it really speaks to the cowardice and immaturity of the American mindset. When things don't go your way or offer an immediate solution, the typical American will just ignore the problem, eventually come to deny it, and bail. This behavior is what led to the colonization of America to begin with, and has been practiced by every single successful capitalist to ever exist. Also, capitalism has made it prohibitively expensive for many people to travel to other countries, much less move to one. This is a really privileged statement for anyone to make. Even if I did have the resources to do this, which would include multiple trips to said country's embassy over the course of many years for interviews, yeah, you don't get to just move to whatever country you want. It would cost me another $2,300 to officially renounce my US citizenship. At that point, I would still, for some reason, have a tax obligation to the United States government. Capitalism is the global economic system that dictates the activities of all nations. If I moved to a socialist country, this would still be the case. Global socialism actually makes more sense if you want real competition, as each country's success would directly benefit the workers, and vice versa. Communism, a stateless, moneyless, classless society, can begin to form once people of independent nations are able to exist and thrive without outside interference. Right now, American capitalism has its hands in every single other country's business by force. Socialism would naturally make governments much smaller, as education and healthcare and housing are far less expensive initiatives than ongoing global military intervention, and are guaranteed ways to create a smarter and stronger and more capable population. Capitalists don't want smart, strong, capable American citizens. That's just more competition.
What I do like about this here is that you have the opportunity to move up. You're not stuck with where you're at.
Let's go back to the example of the newly promoted retail store manager who got the job by ratting out their local union representative. They now have a salary of about $80K a year and believe that capitalism can work for anyone who is willing to work hard. In retail, new managers will often transfer to another location to avoid creating tension with their former coworkers. So, the first thing this new manager does is get rid of any established employees who might have a better understanding of the business than they do, and bring in a group of fresh faces that'll accept a lower wage and keep their mouth shut. Those veteran workers are competition. And hey, this is entry-level work anyway. What do I care if you're good at your job and content with your place in life? There is no incentive to build solidarity with your employer or manager under capitalism. Anyone doing so does it for their own personal benefit. They will replace you. Here's the thing. Most people are not looking to move up. Americans just want to go to work and know that their basic needs are covered, and that they have some extra cash to spend and maybe some to save. That's it. Even many conservatives see the competitive nature of entrepreneurial capitalism and say, no thanks, that's not for me, because they recognize how harmful it is. Yet they still defend the capitalist's right to exploit humanity and the environment in the name of individual freedom. This group also likes to hype up the trade school route, as skilled labor leads to guaranteed work, higher wages, and independence. So why don't we just teach the trades in high school then? Well, your local handyman doesn't want more competition either, nor do they want the general public to have an understanding of their specialized knowledge. Not only that, if everyone had a skill they could monetize, there wouldn't be anyone to take all the minimum wage service jobs. I'm not even sure what you're implying with this one, Bill. Do you think that under socialism, you're just like assigned a job for life? Socialism would actually allow for some level of meritocracy, as one's worth would be based on their actual contributions, not just what they're able to attain for themselves.
An evening at the home of Dr. Margarita Zakharova. Her apartment, within 5 minutes' walk of her work, is on the edge of the city and overlooks Moscow River. From her apartment window, neighbors swimming and boating in the long summer evening. A few apartment house tenants had small vegetable gardens nearby.
Under socialism, if someone were to excel at work, the cooperative they work for would collectively recognize their talents and reward them accordingly.
Education through college is free. The 3,000 students of Irkutsk University will soon move to a new school city which is in process of construction.
If someone were to fall behind at work or appear uninterested, there would be comprehensive mental health services to patiently help that worker take some time off, assess the situation, and maybe transition into a new role. The average worker would know that their work is not their entire existence, and they can clock in, put in the requisite effort, and clock out knowing that their livelihood is secure.
We met a school teacher taking a year's leave with her baby.
I don't think any form of government works because there's human beings running it, and there is inherently going to be backdoor deals, and people are just going to have the in, and they're going to pay off politicians and all of that. But once again, I don't even think you can blame capitalism on that. I think you just can blame sociopathic people that both crave and ascend to positions of power.
The human nature argument in regards to capitalism pretty much says that if you don't give the people who are already in control of humanity the ability to keep doing so, they'll somehow make it worse for us than they already have? What? If we know that there will always be people who crave power, we should have a system in place that limits their ability to do so and makes sure that those most vulnerable are protected. That system is socialism. Socialism is a system of government that puts the power and resources of the nation in the hands of the proletariat, or working class people who do not own property. This process of decentralization is known as the withering of the state. Unfortunately, global capitalism has put strict boundaries in place to make the withering of the state nearly impossible.
Russia, Germany, China, Cuba, and most recently Venezuela have tried, or right now are socialist countries.
Once again, we have your listener attempting to conflate fascism with socialism, as the term Nazi does in fact stand for National Socialism. But as we discussed previously, National Socialism was anti-communist and greatly influenced by American colonialism. Modern Germany's progressive education, healthcare, and immigration models are not examples of socialism. Like most European nations, they are a center-right, capitalist country with a strong Christian base. America started the Cold War with the United Soviet Socialist Republic because they knew they didn't have a snowball's chance in hell against the army that defeated the Nazis. The CIA would spend the next 50 years slowly chipping away at the global communist movement, with capitalism intentionally starving out billions of people along the way. Do you know that the Chinese government just delivers bags of food to your doorstep? Looks like some quality meat and veggies, too. This BBC article from April 2022 portrays China in a kind of food crisis, yet describes the challenges that their vast food delivery system is experiencing while the country attempts to fight COVID. Can we have that? No? Over here, in October 2022, American supermarket giant Kroger purchased major competitor Albertsons in a $24.6 billion deal that immediately got the attention of antitrust regulators, and comes after 2 years of record-breaking profits during a devastating pandemic. Despite their thousands of employees' ongoing exposure to COVID, Kroger has refused to reinstate essential worker pay, deeming it too costly, and has just managed to exceed an employee average pay of $15 an hour. Hey, but don't worry, they're still dedicated to passing along higher cost to the customer when it makes sense to do so. JP Morgan analyst Ken Goldman applauds this decision, suggesting Kroger should pass on more of these costs to shoppers who have gotten used to seeing higher prices everywhere and shown they aren't scared away by them. Global poverty is an American policy choice. Finally, Venezuela is a federal presidential constitutional republic ran by the democratically elected United Socialist Party of Venezuela. They've been experiencing significant political and civil unrest due to the 2013 death of their enigmatic leader, Hugo Chavez. If you have any criticism for these nations, I highly recommend you first go read their constitutions and then come and tell me what the problem is.
You are a donkey.
As far as I know, whatever Cuba was trying to do, we prevented them from doing with a fucking embargo. We've been fucking with them for 60 years.
Thousands of Harvard students, alumni, and Bostonians are here for this significant event, which in a sense climaxes Fidel Castro's visit to the United States. The Cuban Prime Minister will deliver a short speech tonight and then answer questions from those in attendance here at the Harvard Law School Forum. A romantic bearded figure of a man in his green coveralls, insurgent rebel leader, a 32-year-old lawyer, fighter, and visionary, Fidel Castro strikes a note of romance on this college football field. But Americans and other peoples of the free world are asking many questions. Is Fidel Castro the George Washington of Cuba?
The U.S. government supported Fidel Castro's initial coup of the Cuban government in 1959, until he began expropriating American-owned sugar plantations, which, as we discussed earlier, legally allowed slave labor for 20 years after it was abolished in America.
As they hail his seizure announcement, the property taken over is valued at nearly $1 billion. The next day, the Catholic Church condemns Castro's actions, a significant step in this Catholic country.
Cuba's divestment from capitalism led to the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles were hired by the CIA to overthrow the Castro regime.
The CIA had organized the training of the guerrillas and had forcefully advocated the invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense had approved its military aspects, and the Secretary of State had approved its political aspects. Yet, everything went wrong.
Shortly after this failed attempt, the United States banned Cuba from the Organization of American States, which was created in 1948 to promote and consolidate representative democracy, with due respect for the principles of non-intervention.
All of these fucking countries where we've gone in and stuck in heads of the government.
Like the working class, most countries are not looking to constantly expand or isolate themselves from the rest of the world. But due to the inherent insecurity of capitalism, any group that chooses to divest will face inherent challenges, like sanctions and violent military intervention. Because, democracy. If a government wanted to, say, nationalize their major exports so they can provide more resources for their citizens, America can, and regularly does, use its incredible power to stop that from happening.
We'll form this new state without any representation and without any president, without any leader.
All the wars we've fought in over air quote freedom.
Hey, remember when Joe Rogan used to criticize the military-industrial complex instead of simping for warmongers? Those were the days. After retiring from the U.S. Marine Corps in 1931, Smedley Butler's War is a Racket was featured in Reader's Digest. Despite the seemingly anti-capitalist message, including Butler admitting to all sorts of crimes against the global South, his three-part conclusion leaves quite a bit to be desired, and doesn't ever challenge America's role as the bad guy to most of the developing world. Step 1 is to force rich people to be included in the draft, I think. In one sentence, it seems like he's calling for the expropriation of capital itself, but later demands that officers and directors and high-powered executives of our armament factories be conscripted. Step 2 is that the American people get to vote on when we go to war. Hey, no complaints there. While we're at it, let's vote on where our taxes go too. Step 3 is that the American military be limited to self-defense operations only, which I would assume means bringing thousands of troops home and a significant defunding of overseas activities. Sounds great. The problem is, the capitalist response to these liberal deterrents is always going to be, cool story, bro, but no thanks. 6 years after this publication, the United States would enter World War II, and were able to conscript the entire Nazi science division in the process, while bringing in billions of dollars for companies like Ford, Boeing, and Lockheed.
Socialism all starts the same way. Create a boogeyman like corporations, the rich, or a race. Oh yeah, we've never done that in this country. We've never created a boogeyman.
As you clearly point out here, OP continues to erase the violent history of America, while once again trivializing the Holocaust by conflating the persecution of rich people with the subjugation of Black and Indigenous people. Did you catch that? Since 1945, the boogeyman in America has been communism. Anti-communism is the most status quo position one can hold. The American Civil Rights Movement was an extension of the Cold War, and is still being fought to this day. It just got a lot colder. As we learned from Smedley Butler, every politician follows the same set of rules, set forth by the military. The aforementioned Bay of Pigs invasion was arranged by liberal Republican Ike Eisenhower, but was carried out during the first term of John F. Kennedy, a conservative Democrat. Both of these presidents were adamantly against communism in all forms. Kennedy's famous Secret Societies speech is about worker uprisings, not the Illuminati. Go listen to the whole thing.
Blame them for all your problems. Yeah, we never did that. The leaders then promised to fix all the problems.
What's being described here is the type of political pandering we experience every election season in America. The type of freedom we have is the choice between a liberal conservative and a conservative liberal every 4 years.
Some of my Republican friends want to take the economy hostage. I get it.
They all have the same agenda, which is to continue capitalism's unfettered access to the world's resources and labor at as cheap a rate as possible.
Promise that everybody will have the same equity and outcome.
Supporters of capitalism literally tell people all the time that if they work hard, they can experience the same outcome as any successful person. What socialism says is that everyone, regardless of physical location or ability, deserves access to food, housing, and education. We should also receive the full value of our labor. When we have access to all of these things, without condition or debt, only then will we see what people are actually able to contribute to society. Everyone just needs to work harder is simply not a more convincing argument than post-scarcity and profit sharing. It's not a matter of whether I want to work hard or not.
This creates mediocrity, loss of the middle class. Loss of the middle class? Where have I seen that before?
Telling everyone that all they need to do is work hard, and if they fail, they aren't working hard enough, creates mediocrity. Mediocre people are deathly afraid of failure, so they find a place where they won't be bothered, and stay there until they die. That pretty much describes every single conservative I've ever met. This infographic by onlinemba.com, titled "Bring Back the 40-Hour Workweek," offers many examples of how America pushes its citizens to a point of physical and mental disrepair, and is paying the price for it on the global market. Their solution to this problem? Oh yeah, just make sure to clock out on time. Okay, if you want some actual science, Stanford University's John Pencavel found a significant decline in worker productivity after 50 hours. Here, look at all the charts he made about it. I don't know what any of them are saying, but they sure are neat to look at. This MIT study from the year 2000 suggests that workers should only have to put in about 11 hours of work to achieve the same standard of living as someone in 1950, 23 hours to achieve a 1975 standard of living, and 29 hours to achieve a 1990 standard of living. Even though the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1940 limits the work week to 40 hours, it is hardly enforced. Besides, it's common practice to hire part-time employees or private contractors to save on labor costs, like paid vacation and sick leave, which is a guaranteed 1-month minimum for all workers in most developed countries, even contractors. This 2017 study from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that not even 30% of American workers with over 20 years tenure have 1 month of paid vacation. Americans under capitalism are working more hours across all sectors, getting less benefits, and are paying a higher cost of living than previous generations. It's not a debate.
Slowly, the government starts to control every aspect of your life. Why does this sound so familiar?
If the goal is to keep a small group of people with a manipulative agenda from acquiring too much power, capitalism is not a good choice. Victoria 3 is Paradox Interactive's 2022 political grand strategy game that lets you determine the fate of the world between the years of 1836 and 1936. Featuring a litany of intricate details and options, the goal of the game is to diplomatically work with different populations to accomplish one's economic, hegemonic, or egalitarian goals. As in real life, innovation is the heart of each nation's development and is split up into 3 categories: production, military, and society. One acquires more innovation points by increasing literacy rates. Literacy is improved by each population's access to education, which is, of course, determined by the availability of educational institutions. Educational institutions are conceived based on religious, private, or public grounds. We can then see how different populations respond to these educational systems. The most interesting thing about this game is that you aren't just doing capitalism or communism. For example, you could have an anti-colonial, agrarian society that engages in mercantilism with other nations, but limits free trade within its borders, promotes social mobility, and uses a graduated taxation system which is distributed evenly between public health insurance, schools, and a dedicated police force. Many players have noted that this level of intricacy and the lack of available functions like corruption, cronyism, and other, programs of counterintelligence allows egalitarian, worker-driven societies to achieve a much higher average standard of living for all citizens. Developers of Victoria 3 say they just implemented the mechanics the way we understood them, and this is the result, and that the game empowers the industrialist who wants the country's laws configured in a liberal way to assure those profits and their position in society. But if you focus your economy around domestic manufacture and exports of staple consumer goods in highly productive, technologically advanced factories, your lower classes will thrive, become empowered, and assert their rights to democracy, living wages, and humanitarian policies.
Punish the rich, which eventually leads to them leaving the country. Oh yeah, that hasn't happened. Their money leaves the country and then comes back in the form of an interest-free loan that is then forgiven.
What Bill's talking about here is the many tax breaks that exist for major corporations in places like Ireland, and the interest-free Federal Reserve bucks they get when their bullshit eventually tanks the American economy. Again, I want to focus on this whole punishment bit. Why is encouraging people to give without asking for anything in return considered a punishment? I thought these people were Christian. Am I missing something?
Control the media, like promoting the government. Control the media. There's two guys that own the media, Ted Turner and fucking that other guy there, the guy from Fox News. When I was a kid, there was rules on media ownership. No one person can own 7 radio stations, newspapers, TV stations in one market, because they knew if you owned all of that, if you control the media, you control thought.
I really appreciate that, of all people, you chose these two generationally wealthy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant media tycoons, because some people think there is a certain group of people that runs the media. That's right, folks. Rupert Murdoch is
not a Jew.
The illusion of choice is getting more and more apparent in every industry, and it only gets worse as late-stage capitalism trudges along.
American.
Mergers and acquisitions in America are regulated by the 1890 Sherman Act, amended by 1914's Clayton Antitrust Act, and again in 1976 with the Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act. All these laws did was put the Federal Trade Commission in charge of policing the conspiratorial behaviors of corporate executives. The punishment for these crimes is then determined and carried out by the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. In November 2022, the Antitrust Division's San Francisco office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Montana, and the Department of Transportation came together as part of the Justice Department's Procurement Collusion Strike Force to take down Nathan Neffy Zito, the president of a paving and asphalt business who attempted to monopolize the markets for highway crack sealing services in Montana and Wyoming by proposing that his company and its competitor allocate regional markets. He's looking at up to 10 years in prison and a $1 million fine. It was the DOJ's first criminal monopolization case in 50 years.
Eventually, all rights are taken away. Dissenters, journalists, and politicians, oppositions are jailed or executed. Eventually, the leaders will become exactly what they originally campaigned against. Jesus Christ, buddy. If you look at all the rights and everything that you have lost in the last fucking 20 years.
We live in a country where the rights that were handed out as a result of basic human tolerance and understanding are now being repealed. Not only that, untenable housing and work situations have led to a lower quality of life for millions of Americans. I personally thought the entire fucking point of having a fucking democratic government was to expand the fucking rights of all fucking people and raise everyone's quality of life. But apparently there's something wrong with me. The freedom just stops here. It's too much, actually. We need less. Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, and many other anti-American revolutionaries are serving life sentences and have been denied parole by every sitting president. Now, what you think would come next is yet another list of all the horrific shit the United States has done to Black and Indigenous people, but I'm pretty tired of looking at those. And you should be too.
He goes, there's much more to it on an economic level, but as a fellow moron, it's too complicated for me to understand. All right, I am also a fellow moron, but dude, all of that shit has happened.
Don't get it twisted. This listener is blowing some serious far-right dog whistles and getting you to repeat them on your show. In response, you've nailed a bunch of very important points. But we kind of need to be careful when we're criticizing America like this. Don't get me wrong, you should absolutely criticize America. But fascists want the country to appear as unstable as possible, so the new regime can come in and restore law and order. So let's try a slightly different approach. As hard as it is to say, Ronald Reagan was right about one thing.
If fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism.
America is built on the principles of classical liberalism, an ideology popularized by Adam Smith in his 1776 treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Despite being known as the father of capitalism and influencing the likes of Thomas Sowell and Jordan Peterson, many of his philosophical observations actually challenge the capitalist mindset. In a recognition of class struggle 40 years before Karl Marx was even born, Smith categorizes citizens into those who live by rent, those who live by wages, and those who live by profit. He warns of an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and that the proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought always to be listened to with great precaution. He goes on to say, employers constitute the third order, that of those who live by profit. The rate of profit does not, like rent and wages, rise with the prosperity and fall with the declension of the society. On the contrary, it is always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin. Smith goes on to call out 18th century union busting. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and the law authorizes or at least does not prohibit their combinations, while it prohibits those of the workmen. We have no acts of parliament against combining to lower the price of work, but many against combining to raise it. In all such disputes, the master can hold out much longer. Adam Smith was not a capitalist, nor was he creating capitalist propaganda. Like Marx, he was an intellectual making scientific observations about the systems around him and hypothesizing about their future.
CNN and Fox News have the fucking balls to present the people that are on TV as journalists and then also acting as though you're watching news. You're not. You're watching propaganda. That's why we're Hatfields and McCoys right now.
There are two types of American liberal, Republican and Democrat. We don't get a third option because we aren't as politically advanced as nations like Venezuela. Within these groups are two revisionist subcategories, libertarians and what we over here affectionately call rad libs. While the American Republican is generally more socially conservative, the American Libertarian is closer to classical liberalism and is against groupings, or corporations, of all kinds. Libertarians don't like corporate monopolies for the same reason they don't like identity politics. Does that make sense? Although rare in the States, left libertarians do exist and would agree with statements like, regulations may, no doubt, be considered as, in some respects, a violation of natural liberty. But those exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals, which might endanger the security of the whole society, are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments.
That the two libertarian quadrants, libertarian left, where I am, and libertarian right, where the economic libertarians are, those two quadrants, once they recognize that nobody in those quadrants actually knows the description of the system that we should be building, have tremendous reason to unite, because actually we are agreed about values. We are agreed about the fundamental importance of liberty, and now what we need to do is have a discussion about how practical interventions might be and what those interventions we might propose would be in light of what we now know that those who architected the ideas behind socialism didn't know.
If you feel like you do actually agree with many leftist principles, but keep getting called a centrist every time you try to talk about it, I'd recommend learning about the left libertarian movement. A great place to start is Murray Bookchin's 2007 book, Social Ecology and Communalism.
Anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. So these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement, not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life, we would have to turn to anarchism, because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination, but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question not simply of economic exploitation, but exploitation in every sphere of life.
A radlib is someone who believes that the U.S. should adopt the social welfare programs that seem most radical to conservatives, like free college tuition, healthcare, and trans inclusion. A radlib will generally call for higher taxes on the rich to pay for these initiatives. However, the radlib will only really escalate beyond words when they are personally threatened. The primary example of this being the hippie movement. Most hippies didn't care about the military budget or Vietnam's right to practice communism. They just didn't want to go to war. In the mid-1990s, free market libertarian scholar Joseph Overton insisted that think tanks are integral in determining what policies are accepted by the public. This chart, which, in true libertarian fashion, ranges from more free to less free, would later be dubbed the Overton window. In 2009, the University of Pennsylvania identified 6,305 think tanks in 169 countries, with over 500 of them located very close to Washington, D.C. Many promote a nonpartisan agenda. But how far left do they actually go? Let's take a look. Founded in 2003, the progressive think tank Center for American Progress received about $15 million in grants from 58 foundations in their first 4 years of operation. In 2014 alone, they received $45 million. In 2017, they opposed Bernie Sanders' single-payer health plan and was accused of taking money from Blue Cross Blue Shield and other corporations that would be dismantled by the policy.
In our case, I think that we both, need to embrace what the arguments that have been successful with that group of Sanders voters.
In 2020, the New York Times reported that the organization had removed reporting of New York City police surveillance of Muslim communities after receiving a $1.5 million grant from Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Although the 501c3 nonprofit does not disclose its full donor list, the Center for American Progress, or CAP, has also received grants from Walmart, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, defense contractor Northrop Grumman, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Google, Time Warner, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and George Soros.
All right, I took off my Birkenstocks.
As much as conservatives will feign tolerance in public, quiet progressives are conceding to the right even more.
What we're talking about when we talk about that is the absolute pursuit of profit at all human, environmental, and social cost.
The second a radlib feels like they're falling out of the sensible and acceptable zones, they'll start backtracking, so as not to appear too woke.
Can you be a democratic socialist and a capitalist?
Well, I think it depends on your interpretation. So there are some democratic socialists that would say absolutely not. There are other people that are democratic socialists that would say, I think it's possible.
What are you?
I think it's possible.
From Singer Grimes to this 5-star general, radlibs can read all the Marx and Lenin they want, just to admit that things get a lot more complicated when you go out into the real world. To shift the Overton window, you must serve capital. Thanks for watching. I hope this was informative to people arguing both for and against socialism. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and join our Patreon for Discord access, or if you just think this video is worth a few bucks. If not, no problem. This work continues to be incredibly educational and fulfilling for us as creators. So stay tuned. Good night, and good luck.
Holy shit. There it goes.